Are you under stress? No matter where you look today, parents, children, employers, public officials are all under tremendous amounts of stress and pressure. Helping us understand more about how to turn stress into success, I have as my special guest Dr. Alan Weg, a New Jersey licensed psychologist. He is founder and director of Stress and Anxiety Services of New Jersey, an independent practice in East Brunswick, specializing in individual as well as group cognitive behavioral treatment of anxiety disorders and body-focused repetitive behaviors, such as compulsive hair pulling or skin picking in children, adolescents, and adults. Over 75% of clients in his practice present with a primary diagnosis of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Dr. Weg is also co-founder and vice president on the board of directors of OCD New Jersey, a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising public awareness and educating the lay and professional community about OCD and its treatment. In addition, he has been a field clinical supervisor for graduate students at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology at Rutgers University since 1991. Over the years, he has presented dozens of times to many professional mental health organizations on the topic of cognitive behavioral therapy treatment of anxiety disorders and body-focused repetitive behaviors. Dr. Weg is also on the board of directors of the Middlesex County Psychological Association and on the steering committee of the New Jersey Association of Cognitive Behavioral Therapists. He has received certifications both from the Trichotillomania Learning Center as well as the International OCD Foundation's Behavioral Therapy Training Institute. Dr. Weg has appeared on several cable TV talk shows and was most recently featured on the ABC News show Primetime, which focused on the treatment of kids with OCD. Dr. Weg has contributed a book chapter entitled Storytelling and Use of Metaphor in the Treatment of OCD in the Social Worker's Desk Reference, 2nd edition, Oxford University Press in 2008, in response to a specific request by the editor-in-chief. His own book, OCD, Treatment Through Storytelling, A Strategy for Successful Therapy, will be published by Oxford University Press later this year. Dr. Alan Weg, welcome to the Wellness Spotlight.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for having me here.
Alan, tell me, what was it that made you become a psychologist?
I think I'm one of the few people that can say that I've wanted to be a psychologist ever since I was a young adolescent. I had friends who were struggling with things like depression, and found myself being very empathic, and people were just drawn to speaking to me about some of their difficulties, and I found it very gratifying, and it kind of went from there.
And could you tell us the difference between being a psychologist and being a psychiatrist?
Okay, well, they're really very different. Psychiatrist is a medical doctor, a physician, who specializes in psychiatric conditions, mental illnesses, in the same way that a cardiologist would specialize in heart conditions. Psychologist is not a medical professional, but is trained as a therapist.
And could you tell us a little bit about where you studied?
Well, I got my doctorate from Rutgers University, right around the corner here. But I got my master's degree up in Fairleigh Dickinson in Madison, and my undergraduate degree at Cortland State University, which is a SUNY school in upstate New York.
Alan, you know, no matter where you look today, it seems like people are explaining so much about what's going wrong with their life based upon stress. Do we have more stress now than people had years ago than, say, our grandparents had? Or does it just seem like we have more?
It's hard to know for sure, but I guess I would say that the stress is really very different. It's less about, are we going to get food on the table, and working long, hard days, although that for sure happens plenty as well. But I think that we live a very, very fast-paced life compared to our grandparents or most of our grandparents. And that's extremely stressful for very many people.
How do you define stress?
Basically, it's a reaction to things in our world, in our lives, or even our own thoughts that that result in some elevated emotional and physiological response. Sometimes it's good because it's the thing that gets us out of bed in the morning and gets us going and allows us to do well in school or do well on the job. But if it gets out of hand and becomes too much, then it starts working against us.
Can you give me some examples about what you would call good stress as compared to stress that could be potentially harmful?
All right, well, let's say I'm working in a business and I know that I have an important presentations to make the next day at work. I'm going to have a certain amount of stress because of that, but that's going to motivate me to prepare, to really know my stuff, to work well. If, on the other hand, I'm going to be doing a presentation in front of what I expect to be a very hostile audience, and that if I don't do a good enough job, I might get fired, that might end up creating so much stress that I end up not being able to concentrate or not sleeping well the night before, and I end up not doing as well as I might have done otherwise.
You make a distinction between fear and anxiety. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I see, and there's not a complete consensus about this, Ken. I mean, people have different ideas about what these terms mean, and a lot of times they're used interchangeably. But the way that I see it, anxiety is more of a chronic condition. I have a lot of anxiety over a course of a long period of time, whereas fear is a very acute reaction to a very specific situation. So I might be anxious in general about driving, but I have a specific fear reaction when I'm on the road in the moment in a particular situation.
Now, how do these things affect a person? I mean, aside from the obvious mental consequences, physiologically, what do fear and anxiety do to a person?
Well, there's this concept that a lot of people have learned back in high school called the fight or flight response, which essentially means that our bodies react in a way that allows us to either fight back whatever physical threat, and this goes way back in time.
Come around the corner, you see a saber-toothed tiger,
right.
Your body gets in motion, so you're ready to fight it, or
run away.
Run right up a tree.
Right. And so everything that happens to us when we experience anxiety or fear is really designed to help us better run or fight. So we breathe more quickly, so we get more oxygen into our bodies, and our hearts pump more quickly so that the blood is able to take that oxygen to different parts of our bodies more quickly. Our digestive system essentially shuts down because at a certain level our body says, well, digestion is important, but not right now. We have an emergency situation, and so we're going to focus everything on things like thinking as quickly as possible and moving those large muscle groups as much as possible. So the blood vessels also constrict, they tighten up around the surface of our skin because we don't need small finger dexterity when a saber-toothed tiger is breathing down our necks, which is why sometimes our hands will get cold, but our face or head will get flushed. And a whole host of different hormonal and neurological and muscular changes take place.
The adrenals kick in.
Right, the pupils dilate so that you can see, but the hearing becomes more acute. You perspire for several reasons. One, because you know, when your body is wet and you feel a cool breeze, it cools your body because evaporation is a cooling process. So it's like throwing cold water on a hot engine to make sure that it doesn't overheat. It also is more difficult to grab something when it's very wet and slippery. And so if an animal was after you 30,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago, if you were, you know, sweaty, it would be harder for it to grab a hold of you. So everything really is designed for that level of survival.
Okay, but now we don't have saber-toothed tigers running around East Brunswick anymore. So years ago, we'd see the tiger, we'd have our reaction, and we'd either get eaten, so the problem would go away, or we'd run away, and eventually the tiger would go away, so the problem would go away. But now, we're confronted with all kinds of things to make our lives stressful. We are concerned about being able to make ends meet in the economy. We see the fluctuations in the stock market and wonder whether or not our retirement is going to be there. We are concerned about being able to raise children in a healthy environment so they grow up to be upstanding citizens, and on and on and on. So it seems like the fear may have a tendency of not going away. you know, or the anxiety may not go away. What's the long-term effect of this?
Well, a lot of people who have this problem where they have a lot of anxiety for chronic periods of time can easily tell you that often there's a breakdown in the system. The fight or flight response was designed to be an emergency response, a short-lived response, and then there's a time afterwards for recovery. But if you're sitting in traffic jams for 2 hours every single day, day after day after day, and then you're worried about what's going to be happening at work all day long, and then you come home and you have to deal with the bills, and it's just on and on and on like that, there tends to be a breakdown. And people experience all kinds of symptoms, such as chronic headaches, stomach problems, muscle aches and pains, and also difficulties in changing certain aspects of their activities of daily living. So they may eat too much or not eat enough, or sleep too much or not sleep enough, irritability, poor concentration. These are the kinds of things that begin to tell us that the anxiety is taking its toll, and we really have to do something about it.
And then that can bleed into all aspects of their life, either on their own body and their own health, on their ability to be able to perform at their best, to be able to be as productive as they could be, or the quality of their relationships.
Absolutely.
I would figure. So what is it about different people that cause them to respond in different ways? Because you could have two people that are subjected to the same kinds of stresses, and yet one person would be fearful and anxious, and the other person, it rolls off their back like water off a duck.
All right, well, I'll give you a little Psychology 101 here, and you know, I'm executive director at the Stress and Anxiety Services of New Jersey, and there we practice cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very specific kind of therapy, and a lot of the focus there is on cognitions, which is just a fancy word for thoughts, thinking, and the idea there basically is the way we think about something has profound implications for how we respond physiologically and emotionally, and so it's really the thinking process, the way that we think about something as opposed to the thing itself, that will make us anxious. That's why you can have two people in the very same circumstance, and one reacts calmly and the other reacts more negatively or overreacts. One person says, I can handle this, this will be okay, or there's really nothing I can do about this right now, I need to just kind of move on. And the other person will just sort of bang his or her head against the wall saying, this can't be happening, I can't let this happen, I have to do something, even when there really isn't very much that they can do about it.
What determines how a person reacts the way that they do, Alan? Is it something, is it genetic? Is a person's reaction to circumstances something that's pre-programmed in, or is it something that they learned growing up?
The $10 million question. The short answer to that is, well, we really don't know. But it's clear that both of those components play a role, that whole nature and nurture controversy. The problem is, if I grew up in a household where my parents are both, very calm and tend to be very thoughtful and react slowly to things in terms of their emotional reactivity, well, if I'm the same way, how do I know if that's because they modeled it for me and I learned that way, or because somehow they genetically transferred to me that way of being? The sense is that there tends to be a genetic predisposition, and then your experience growing up has strong influence on how you learn to deal with things.
Well, that covers all the bases, doesn't it?
I told you we really don't know.
So, Alan, I speak, being the father of a couple of kids and knowing a lot of other parents in town, and you have a family too, parents today are very concerned with the type of childhood experience that our children have. It seems to be very different than the experiences that we had as kids, where we came home from school and then we had plenty of time to go outside and play and air out a little bit,
right,
and then have dinner with our family and then go upstairs, do our homework, and then go to bed at a decent hour. But a lot of the parents that I speak with today, and I can see from our own children at home too, they don't have that kind of experience like we had as kids. These are intelligent children that come home, don't have time to be able to go outside and play, have to hit the books from the time that they get home, and work sometimes straight through to the middle of the night, getting to bed at around 11 or 12 o'clock, and under tremendous stress. What can we do about something like that? We can't change the curriculum in the school.
That's right.
So what options do parents have to be able to help their kids when they're subjected to these kinds of stresses?
Well, this is a really good example, Ken, of how you can look at a situation and basically say, all right, what can I control and what can't I control? at the very core of stress management is being able to answer that question. Because if you answer that question incorrectly, then you're trying to change things in your life that are really not changeable, and you are banging your head against the wall. On the other hand, if you accept things that you can influence without trying to change them, well, then you're subjecting yourself to stressors, stress situations that you really don't have to. So in this particular example, there is school curriculum. There are a lot of competitive sports and organizations that kids belong to these days, and if you try to pull them out of everything, the problem is that because all the other kids are involved in those things, it isn't like they have a whole bunch of kids down the block to play with like maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago. So you really can't do that, and I don't think the children that you have, or that anyone would have, would necessarily appreciate that. I think more than anything else, it's about saying, well, how can we influence this in some way? And that's about striking some kind of a balance, making sure that there is time for a family to be together, try to work out as best as possible to have at least one night or 2 nights a week where everybody eats together, dinner, to set certain limits on how much time kids are on Facebook or how many activities they do engage in. And to negotiate that and make the child part and parcel of that negotiation process so they feel like they have an influence on the process, but that they have to recognize that there are limits. They can't do everything, even if any one of those things would be a good thing to do. You can't do everything.
So it sounds to me what we're really talking about is things that parents may be able to do to expand their children's capacity. In other words, what you're suggesting is that not to put time or energy or focus or attention on the things that you can't do anything about, and focus your time and energy and efforts on the things that you can do something about. So as an expert, and as an expert that also specializes in helping lots of families and children, what would you say would be, if there is such a thing, a balance between academics, social, and personal?
Well, I'm not going to come up with any particular formula because that's going to be a very individualized thing depending on the kid, depending on the family, depending on their social situation. But the bottom line is that it is something that needs to be negotiated where both the parents and the child are part of the process, so that the child feels that he or she has a say in terms of what it is that they're allowed to do or what it is that they're saying no to, and it really isn't just dictated by the parents.
So what would be some of the signs that a parent would observe that would tip them off as to whether or not things are out of balance?
Okay. We have a term that are called stress response patterns. The things that a person does behaviorally, emotionally, that they experience that indicates there's a problem, that there's stress in a bad way. And so things like if you see that your child grades are falling, if you find that they tend to be irritable, they're having difficulty falling asleep, they're not eating where they normally would eat, those are the kinds of signs that something is wrong. You know, for so many problems that parents experience with their kids, you hear one line that comes over and over and over, comes up over and over again, and that is spend time with your kids, talk to them, but most importantly, listen to them. Because if you have open communication with your child, if they feel comfortable enough that you have the time and the energy to spend being there for them and listening to them, they will get into the habit of talking to you when they're feeling stressed, when they're having problems, and then they can use you as the resource that you should be for them and as the support that you should be there for them.
So it seems like one of the age-old challenges that the older generation seems to have with the younger generation is the ability to be able to effectively communicate.
Yes.
What is it that parents can do to be able to open up the lines and foster open communication between their children and themselves?
One is to start doing it from an early age, from a very early age. The other is to make it something of a habit. And so, you know, the standard used to be you sit around the dinner table and how was your day kind of thing. We can't always do that, but there's times in the car. And the car rides are wonderful opportunities to engage with your kid rather than having the radio blasting or having them tune into the iPod or their, whatever electronic device they're playing with. So making the time, and that when you're involved in a conversation with your child, to make rules about electronic interference. And what I mean by that is I don't want to have a conversation with you while you're having a conversation texting someone else, which they do amongst themselves all the time, and I'm not necessarily saying that itself is a problem, but you really want to be present, and you want to teach them to be present with you when you're having a talk with them about things that you're concerned about, or just asking them how their day is.
Alan, earlier you alluded to the importance of a person's mindset, you know, that you work with people on how they think. And that seems to be a very timeless value. You know, even in the Bible, it states that as a man thinketh, so shall it be done unto him. And many people who have been experts in success and in motivation talk about the importance of positive thinking. What are some of the things that can actually deflate a person's ability to be able to think at their best? And for people who want to adopt better ways of thinking, but it seems to fly in the face of what's going on in their lives today, how can they think better?
When we work with the kids, we call it stinking thinking, which is really this sort of barrage of negative statements that a person says to themselves, either about themselves, about their lives, about their situation.
So give me some examples of some of the things you most commonly hear today.
I'm not going to be able to do this, I'm going to fail. That person isn't going to like me. I guess things along those lines.
I don't fit, I don't belong.
Right.
It's never going to happen.
It's never going to happen. But a lot of it has to do, especially with children and especially with adolescents, is I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to fail in some way. I'm going to be seen in a negative light by others because, you know, peer influence is very, very important at that stage. And so in cognitive behavioral therapy, we have a term called cognitive restructuring, which is just a fancy way of saying looking at your thoughts, taking them apart, and then putting back together and again in a way that's more functional. And really what you're doing is you're really asking yourself, okay, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling stressed. What am I saying to myself about the situation that's making me feel stressed? Am I thinking I'm going to end up failing that test tomorrow? Am I thinking that my girlfriend's going to break up with me? What is it that the conversation in my head is all about? And once you've identified what are the sources of this stress that you're experiencing, then you begin to question certain aspects of that. For instance, first of all, how sure am I that what I'm thinking to myself really represents what's happening or what might happen? And there you look at the facts. Well, what do I know? What has she done? What has he done? How have I done in the past in terms of classes, et cetera? Have I studied? Do I know my stuff? Most of the time, we find that we over-exaggerate the probability that something bad will actually happen or that we'll fail. But we could take it to another step, which is, let's say the thing that we're afraid of actually happens. Well, how bad would that really be? What would really be the consequences? People kind of play this scene out in their head where they imagine a worst-case scenario and then it stops. And then they replay that over and over again. They never say, well, what happens the next day or the next month or the next year?
So if we peel the onion, if you peel the psychological onion, then what's really going on? Does it stem from a person's lowered sense of self-esteem? Does it come from their challenge in accepting change in their life? Does it come from their inability to be able to confront certain things in themselves or in people around them?
Probably more than anything else, it's a habitual kind of way of responding. People will tend to avoid things that make them feel uncomfortable, and so they'll avoid challenges at times, and then they end up feeling bad about themselves that they haven't done certain kinds of things, and that feeds their sense of inadequacy, and it becomes a cycle because now I feel less capable about doing the next challenge. Whereas if you recognize that chances are I might do okay, and if I don't do that well, it's no big deal. It's all small stuff kind of thinking, then I'm more likely to take the chances and feel good about the fact that at least I took the risks. And even if I didn't do well, I can move forward saying, it wasn't so bad, I can always try again. And if I did do well, then that very directly feeds my self-esteem and breaks me out of that cycle.
So Ellen, if a person is interested in coming to you, how does it work? You know, can you take us step by step through the process?
I mean, very specifically, they call our telephone number. They would speak with me first. We ask basic series of questions in terms of what's going on.
Over the phone?
Over the phone, very briefly, 5 minutes. And then based on what the person is telling me and based on availability and schedule, they would see either myself or one of the other 3 psychologists that we have on staff. At that point, they'd either set up an appointment with me directly or one of the other therapists would then call them, set up an appointment, they'd come in. And typically, the first session is about an hour long. And the focus is really, it's an interview. It's an intake, we call it, where the therapist will be asking a series of questions about what's going on, as well as a history and background and that sort of thing. And it also is an opportunity for the therapist to share with the new client what it is that they can expect to get from the therapist and from therapy if they continue to come. So they can leave saying, okay, this is what this person is offering to me. This is what we've decided would be the problems that we would work on and the kinds of things that would happen in therapy. Am I interested in, making the commitment? And the commitment, we usually say ballpark is, a once-a-week kind of therapy, which is a 45-minute session, for about a period of 12 weeks, about a 3-month period. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. But our main message there is this is not something typically that's a 2 or 3 meeting kind of thing. On the other hand, with this kind of therapy, at least, it isn't something that you're coming 3 times a week for the next 3 years.
I understand. And when does a person know when they need a therapist?
Sometimes they don't. But typically, because we do a lot of work with anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, different kinds of stress, social phobias, that kind of stuff, panic, people feel distressed. They want to get better. They feel that their lives are unraveling. They're finding that because they're experiencing the symptoms we talked about earlier, I'm not eating well, I'm losing weight, or I'm eating too much, I'm not sleeping, I'm very irritable, I'm having difficulty concentrating, I'm not doing well at work or in school. Things are happening, and they want to learn how to get control back. Those are the reasons why people usually come to see us.
Well, what's the difference between anxiety disorders and anxiety problems?
It's really just a title. Anxiety itself is not necessarily a problem until it's a problem. And people will often say, well, I feel stress. Everybody feels stress, but I don't feel like I have to go to a therapist. And my response to that is, fine. People come to therapists when, or people should come to therapists when their stress is creating a problem for them. It's not a problem until it's a problem.
I see. And we've talked a lot about unhealthy patterns of thinking. What is it that a person can do to be able to foster healthier patterns of thinking outside of going to a therapist? Okay. I'll tell you a really good exercise for that. I would suggest to people to go to people who they respect, people who know them, people who are part of their family members or friends, and ask them, what is it that you like about me? What are the things about me that you see are my strengths? Because a lot of times we don't really see it in ourselves, but people will be fine pointing it out to us, and kind of hearing that can be a very nice exercise. Sometimes with people who have a lot of this sort of stinking thinking that we talked about earlier, we'll do a homework assignment. And one of the things about cognitive behavioral therapy is a lot of work is done in between the therapy sessions. It's like school. You learn stuff, and then you have a lot of homework to do in between sessions. For the kids, we call it practice, because homework has a very bad connotation sometimes. But I'll ask people to write down 2 or 3 things that you did really well that day, or that you can feel good about, so that you're teaching yourself to focus on the positive and not always focus on the negative. What do you feel about, quickly, what do you think about writing affirmations and doing visualizations and writing goals?
All of those are tools, and if they're used effectively, they can be very helpful. In cognitive behavioral therapy especially, there's a long list of different tools that we use for depression, for anxiety, et cetera. And what I found is I usually share multiple tools for people. And what seems to work really well and what really resonates with one person is not going to work as well with the next. And so I usually say, try this for a while, see how it feels. If you want to adjust it, tweak it around after a while to meet your personal style, that's fine. Or if you want to sort of give up one item or 2 items, that's fine too. Really just gear it up to your own personal way of doing things.
Dr. Alan Wegg, it's been an absolute delight having you as a guest on the Wellness Spotlight today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights in showing our viewers how we can think better and how to have a happier, healthier life.
Thank you so very much for having me again.
This concludes another segment of the East Brunswick Advisory Health Council's Wellness Spotlight. I'm Dr. Ken Friedman, President of the East Brunswick Advisory Health Council, reminding you that wellness works when you work it.